Welcome back to the Critical Thinking Tools podcast, Season 2, Episode 1. This is on the empirical attitude in the humanities. This is Lawrence Patius. I'm a psychologist at Portsmouth University. Now, I just want to say, why did I start this podcast? Well, it was aimed at undergraduates. Of course, it can be listened by anybody. But I was thinking about first-year undergraduate students who have a lot of knowledge packed into their minds through A-levels in the UK. They may not have had the time to learn how to critically think, how to distinguish between science and pseudoscience on the one hand in the sciences, and between good work in the humanities versus poor work in the humanities. In this episode, I want to emphasize how beautiful the humanities are if they are studied in a certain way, using careful balancing of evidence, a careful evaluation of evidence, a deliberate search for disconfirming evidence, which is a little bit similar to science, and a focus on what is objectively true in the humanities as opposed to what is subjective, and also in some of the arts, a focus on what is objectively beautiful rather than what is subjectively beautiful. So let's start out by getting another voice on this subject. Frederick Cruz is a retired University of California, Berkeley professor. He was an English literature professor, worked in literary criticism. And he noticed in his field a problem in some attitudes towards the English literature catalogue. And in this clip I'm going to play you, he talks about having a different approach to the humanities, a more traditional approach, which is maybe more fruitful, more enjoyable, called the empirical approach to the humanities. So let's hear him.
What interests me is general rationality, of which science is a part. And general rationality requires us to observe the world carefully, to consider alternative hypotheses to our own hypotheses, to gather evidence in a responsible way, to answer objections. These are habits of mind that science shares with good history, good sociology, good political science, good economics, what have you. And I summarize all this in what I call the empirical attitude. It's a combination of feeling responsible to the evidence that is available, feeling responsible to go out and find that evidence, including the evidence that is contrary to one's presumptions, and responsibility to be logical with oneself and others. And this is an ideal that is not so much individual as social. The rational attitude doesn't really work when simply applied to oneself. It is something that we owe to each other. We submit our ideas to each other in a way that enables them to be clear enough, non-contradictory enough, to be accessible to refutation. And that's as true of propositions about literature as it is of propositions about quarks and protons. Well, of course, the university exists to court differences of opinion, but principled differences of opinion. What's happened in the humanities is a general assault on the very idea of the empirical, the very idea of the rational, which are now associated with such social evils as racism, patriarchy, and so forth. And in the vacuum that is created by this denigration of the empirical, nothing is left but cliquishness. Nothing is left but power.
Okay, so that is Frederick Cruz laying out his idea of what should be done in the humanities, which he says is the empirical attitude, which is carefully balancing out evidence, having a search for disconfirming evidence, and that kind of thing, an appreciation of beauty. I think he would agree with that as well. And if you want to read more from Frederick Cruz on this matter, there is a great book called Skeptical Engagements, which was written by him in 1986. So before I go on to talking about some of the different arts and humanities departments and how they might be viewed with the empirical method as an opposed to maybe a postmodern method, which I think is not as interesting, not as beautiful, not as enriching to people's lives as the traditional method. I just want to say what is wonderful about the humanities, because I don't want this podcast to be a criticism of modern humanities departments, where I'm sure a lot of them are doing fantastic work. Well, the arts and humanities are essential to our lives. They bring solace to us, they bring entertainment to us, they help us make meaning out of what's going on in the world. They lead to wonderful films that help us understand things. So there's a lot that they offer us in terms of comfort, but also in learning. We learn about the world through the humanities. And of course, you don't want to denigrate the humanities as has been done in the past. There's a famous line in Schindler's List where one of the Jewish professors who has been arrested by the Nazis, he says in this scene in Schindler's List, he says, history and literature, how is that not essential? You know, because they are sorting people into being essential workers and non-essential work. So, the humanities should not be underestimated. There's great comfort that comes from art. There's great feelings of belonging that comes from good architecture. There's great learning and how to prevent future disasters that comes from history. You learn a lot about human nature and psychology from English literature. And you gain skills, you get great entertainment and solace from music, and you come to understand the world and think about the world in a wonderful way through philosophy. So all of them are beautiful. I wouldn't want to discourage any young student from having a whole career in the humanities. However, I would encourage them to use the empirical method if they do go into the humanities, and I encourage university departments to also use traditional means of weighing evidence in the empirical attitude. And the alternative that has happened, and here we go into the criticism of some humanities departments in the late 20th century, mid-late 20th century as well, is that they were very affected by postmodernism. So postmodernism in the humanities was an attack on the modern, so attack on a lot of the humanities work that was done in the couple of hundred years after the Enlightenment, work in the humanities that was done before 1950, for example. The postmodern and critical theory approaches to the humanities would denigrate work done by white Europeans, for example, and make an identity politics argument about why you should not read this great work of literature, or why you should not believe a whole set of historical narratives that we have developed over time. So that's a general criticism of, really a warning to young people of the pitfalls of the postmodernism and critical theory in the humanities. It can really undermine your joy of the humanities, but also really indoctrinate you into a kind of miserable belief system that kind of separates you from great art, great architecture, great history, accurate history, I should say, great literature, and so on. And the side of philosophy that's actually useful, that, and interesting, rather than up in the air and nonsense. I would say it is a waste of time when it becomes very obscure. So let's take it one subject at a time and talk about how you can apply this kind of empirical attitude to some of these areas. So let's take art and architecture to start with. Since the 1930s, I think there's been a undermining of an approach to art and architecture that focuses on producing something that's objectively beautiful. All right. So in other words, something that almost everybody would agree, if they were to look at it, it is beautiful. And since the 1930s and the effects of the 1950s as well, and the rise of postmodernism, there was quite a lot of rebellion against that old style of art. So, in other words, art before 1930 in paintings tended to be beautiful. Before the Impressionist area, they tended to be realistic and beautiful. And then in a lot of modern art, there's been quite a lot of rebellion about what is art. So you would see displays of urinals, and that was supposed to be art. It's not really that beautiful. And splattered paint in some of the modern attempts at art, which is clearly not beautiful to everybody's eyes. Just kind of illustrate the shift away from aiming at beauty and weighing up whether something is good art coming from other people, and a shift towards subjective beauty, which not many people do actually find beauty unless they're being pretentious. And something similar happened in architecture, and Roger Scruton was a philosophy professor who does a much better job of knowing about this and writing about this. But his argument was that since the 1930s, the focus in architecture of creating something beautiful that you can live in for hundreds and hundreds of years without wanting to tear it down has gone. So you will notice in older buildings, there's quite a lot of detail, shadows, beautiful curves, statues, and so on, where there was a great deal of attention made to make it look beautiful. And then since then, function is more weighed in comparison to beauty. So you get functional buildings that don't have any shadows, that are not good to look at, and they feel oppressive to be around. So in general, in art and architecture, there's been a loss in focus on beauty, and maybe that has come back in some approaches to art and architecture. And it's connected to what we've been talking about in past podcasts, in that there is something empirically objective about creating something in architecture that is objectively beautiful to the majority of people. The classical approach in Greek and Roman empires was similar, a focus on beauty, and then that seems to be lost in the postmodern era. So to enjoy these artistic subjects, a return to a focus on what is objectively beautiful would probably be very appreciated and quite enriching to the soul. Now, if we move on to the subjective history and how that can be done empirically and rationally, as Frederick would advise, and how it can be done less accurately, less scientifically, through a political lens of looking through a postmodern lens at history, or looking through a critical theory lens. So a good department of history, which is kind of enriching and interesting and not brainwashing, would take an empirical approach to documenting history and allowing the reader of history to decide for themselves. It would use the actively seeking of disconfirming evidence, very similar to science. So if you have a theory, you think the American project started in 1619, for example, and you create a narrative, the best way to be a historian is very similar to science, is you actively seek disconfirming evidence. You are oppositional in your own theories. You try and look for documents and so on that show that, no, it's not actually true, that this narrative you've created is true. So you remove the politics, be as unbiased as you can, exactly the same as science. Now, there has been a movement in history departments, and I know this because my friend Kevin Felstead has a PhD in history, and he tells me about it, to bring in the political. So, some history professors will document history through a Marxist perspective, as Kevin Felstead told me one of his professors did. Critical theory perspective, where you critique the whole of Western civilization through a kind of Marxist lens. A lens, in other words, that is critical of capitalism, critical of free market economies in such a way as it becomes hypercritical and not appreciative of the advances, not really focused on the advances that came from those free societies. So that's history. Similar kind of approach can be used in English. So as Frederick talked about using his empirical method, you can do that as well in English. So in literary criticism, for example, you can critique articles in a way where you are quite objectively documenting what is in the classic literature. You have a kind of appreciation so that you're not hypercritical, as the postmodernists would be. You have an appreciation for beauty in that literature, and you seek out disconfirming evidence for your ideas as well. I think there is a beautiful way of doing English literature in that way. It's very interesting to people and doesn't really put anybody off. However, according to Fred Cruz and others, there was a movement in literary criticism and English more generally in academia, starting in America in the 1970s, late 60s, that was hypercritical of the whole Western canon of literature. And the pressure to publish to get tenure in those departments was partly to blame for this, because what people started to do is to use Freudian theory to deeply critique a classic work of English, or to use Marxist or critical theory to deeply critique, and I really mean cynically critique, famous literary books and so on, in such a way that it destroyed all love of these great works. It was hypercritical not just of the content, but it's also hypercritical of who was doing the writing. So there was a movement to critique the white skin color of the writers, and that became part of the critique. The gender of the writers was critiqued. So famous writers would be denigrated for being straight white males, using the lens of critical theory and postmodernism. So this is a very miserable and not productive way of publishing hundreds of articles that are obscure and politicized, basically. These kind of articles don't really give the student a chance to love the literature, to enjoy it, which is really the purpose of arts and humanities, is to provide solace and enjoyment and some deep learning about psychology as well. So the trouble with this approach to the humanities is that instead of learning some deep psychology and some deep knowledge of archetypes from Shakespeare, you end up focusing on how Shakespeare was white, male, and maybe heterosexual too. So it's quite a negative way of going about the humanities. Let's move on to sociology. So sociology is like psychology, but with sociology, they more focus on the behavior of groups. And this can be done very well using an empirical balance method, where you use maybe quantitative methods to test a hypothesis, and you allow your hypothesis to be falsifiable, and then you actively seek disconfirming evidence. Great. That is a good scientific side of sociology. However, there's a lot of sociology that is very politicized, very much affected by postmodernism and critical theory too. And some of that sociology is unreadable. It's not very careful either. In other words, I have read some sociology recently where the author was asserting a relationship between variables which they had not even tested. You know, it was just an idea in their mind which was not quantitatively assessed. And the person was even going on to say that there's a causal relationship between these variables as well. So again, a quantitative, balanced, honest, non-cynical approach to sociology is the way to go. Now let's move to another subject under the umbrella of arts and sciences, and that is music. So music has also been affected by this postmodern revolution in the humanities. Some departments have been very reluctant to go down that absurdist road, but some haven't. And there are hundreds of years of mini empirical findings of how to play instruments that can be passed down. There is a kind of empiricism to creating music where you either do a good job in creating the music and it works, or the production of sounds fails to produce a beautiful effect. And as I was saying, the traditions of learning not only how to play music, but also how to teach music is like a massive pile of empirical findings that have been accumulated over time. And you need all of that knowledge to be passed on from one generation to the next so that you have successful players and successful passing on of beautiful music as well. And not only that, an appreciation of the beautiful music. And in a sense, all of the classics that are taught repeatedly over decades and centuries in music have, in a sense, been empirically tested as being beautiful by hundreds and hundreds of people, generation after generation after generation. So taking that empirical approach, you would try and keep some of those traditions, most of those traditions, but by taking a postmodern approach to music, you would end up deeply criticizing what was done before the postmodern era, the modern era they might call it, and demand such a revolutionary change in the teaching of music, such as introducing new music that is popular with young students, tailoring your course to be cool with the students. Some of that will lose traditional knowledge. That's a problem with it. And an example of the problems that music has faced during this era, the music department at Oxford Brookes University has just closed down, and that is after they had a very strong music program. They were advised by administration to change their music program to be more up-to-date, to be more modern. Perhaps it was affected by postmodern ideas, to throw out classics, for example. And as a result of that, students didn't find it as compelling to go and study there, and the numbers of enrollment went down. So in other words, for all the theorizing that you had to throw out all of these traditions, what actually happened is when you did throw out some of these traditions, enrollment went down. And it's sad to see humanities departments close down. And I think if humanities departments do not want to be closed down, I think they have to hold on to the traditional way of doing things that worked for the century before the postmodern era. And I think, ironically, young people actually like that more, the solid traditional approach to the humanities in general. I don't really think students in the long run want a kind of postmodern revolutionary approach, a politicized approach to any of these arts and humanities. Even though it might make the course easier in the short term, eventually employers will pick up on the fact that students are being indoctrinated in these humanities courses, and they're actually not that good at playing music anymore, or they're not that good at history anymore, and then they may not be hired. So that's the danger of that. And finally, in this podcast, let's talk about philosophy, which is under the umbrella of humanities. And again, there's a beautiful way of doing it. There's a beautiful half of philosophy, and then there is a very much a unscientific side of philosophy, a side of philosophy that is very obscure, not actually that interesting, very very pretentious. The type of philosophy that sometimes you associate with the word philosophy. It's kind of not useful in the world. It's pretentious and so on. And I think philosophy is beautiful. I think you should go into it if you're interested in it. But when you do go into it, what I would do is focus on some of the greats in philosophy that actually do matter in your life, such as ethics and morals from ancient Greece and then from the Enlightenment. such as the philosophy of science, which is another really solid area of fantastic philosophy. I mean, the debates between Karl Popper, who focuses on falsifiability, and the great history of science done by Thomas Kuhn, the battles between Kuhn and Popper and his student Feyerabend. It's just wonderful stuff that matters in the world, and so that's a wonderful side of philosophy. And then there's some of the most interesting professors who go out to be public intellectuals are also philosophers, you know, like Roger Scruton and many others. So there's this. So if you take the approach of philosophy of carefully appreciating past philosophy, learning the classics, learning how these individuals have wrestled with the problems of living in a city, in a society, the morals of that, the philosophy of law being developed over time, especially since the Enlightenment, and all of the benefits from the philosophy of John Locke, which led to a kind of a liberal revolution in the Western world that gave a lot of the freedoms that you enjoy today their first chance at life. And then the later liberal philosophy of John Stuart Mill then built on this. This is all wonderful areas of philosophy. Now, what areas of philosophy would you not want to focus on if you did have a career in philosophy? Well, I think you might waste your time on the most obscure areas of philosophy that are not empirical and they're idealistic, and they don't deal with the measurable either. So the branch of philosophy that can be a waste of time is probably that philosophy that's followed J.W.F. Hegel. So Hegel was a great philosopher, actually, very interesting to read, but he started a branch of German idealism that was talking about spirit, the spirit of groups, and concepts like that are very much up in the air and more spiritual than connected to measurement. Hegel was a great philosopher, but some of the philosophers that followed him, such as Karl Marx, were Karl Marx's philosophy was even more flawed than Hegel's, and that's the kind of branch that I would avoid as a young student. I would learn about them, but learn about them in a critical kind of way. And then the philosophy in the 20th century of critical theory also is quite obscure, difficult to understand, but when you do understand it, it's quite indoctrinating against Western ideas. It's quite pro-communism, pro-socialism, and then postmodernism in the mid-20th century has some good ideas in it, in the idea that it's difficult to obtain objective truth, but it goes way too far into saying that there is no objective truth, and it developed into the idea that there are relative truths. So my truth is good as your truth. So it's really a move away from the philosophy of there being an objective truth. So those areas of postmodernism, and then more recently, the critical social justice philosophy is also an obscure way of playing around in your mind without actually getting into the real beautiful philosophy of the classics of modern philosophy rather than postmodern philosophy. So there you have it. There is my summary of how to navigate the humanities if you're a young student without wasting too much time in the humanities. If you do choose to go into the humanities, I hope you can use this to focus on appreciating past work, appreciating beauty, and appreciating the fact that you can weigh evidence in the humanities in a similar way to which we do in the sciences. Okay, bye for now. Just a quick postscript correction. After thinking about it, I disagree with something I said earlier. When it comes to the arts, I don't think the empirical approach is so much to say that art is objectively beautiful. In the modern era of art, before the postmodern era, it was subjective whether everybody found something beautiful, but it was closer to being objective than it was in the postmodern era. In the postmodern era, the subjectivity of what is art became ludicrously subjective. So you went from fairly subjective to ludicrously subjective. So I think that corrects it.